So one is as related with the image of a country in the minds of peers or other states, and another is what values or principles are there in the foreign policy that comes from the self-identity of a country. At the same time, the effort since 1990s to bring a rapprochement between Russia and the West, primarily the US, have not resulted into a major breakthrough. So that situation is also on the boil. Insofar as China continues its aggressive, assertive approach and it becomes a challenge to the rules-based order, India would have to become part of solutions. India's major relations are defined in terms of partnership. We should not forget that. We are not too keen to join any military alliances in the traditional sense because we don't want to get entangled into others' conflict.
India got independence on 15th August 1947. On the eve of independence, India got a highly fragmented world. The world was bipolar. It was divided into two blocks. One block was dominated by USA, which was the capitalist bloc, and another bloc which was dominated by USSR, which was the socialist and communist bloc. India had very limited choices available to make its strategic choices in a foreign policy. India carefully navigated this situation, and in the form of non-alignment, India chose its path. Another set of issues observed in 1991, when India's closest ally and a major defense partner, USSR, got disintegrated. At the same time, India also got another major issue, which was the balance of payment crisis of 1991. India managed carefully this situation, and in the form of LPG reforms of 1991, India managed its economic policy along with its foreign policy. In the last 30 years, India carefully navigated this particular situation. There were a lot of changes in India's foreign policy as well as the economic policy. Some changes were voluntary, which was made by India, but other were compulsory also. Today, in this discussion, we are going to discuss a lot of aspects regarding this from the very basic. So hello dear aspirants, I am Vishal Salsekar and I welcome you all to this special conversational series on international relations. To declutter this topic, I am joined by Anjani Sir, who is the faculty of Vision IAS. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Vishal.
So, sir, as we are discussing this foreign policy related topic, so for our aspirants, like what exactly is the foreign policy and what are the purpose of the foreign policy in general?
So it's good to start with the purpose of foreign policy rather than defining it. It can be seen in three major ways. One, foreign policy consists of set of strategies and principles when a country is engaging with its external partners. So it's a policy which guides the behavior of a country in the external domain, just as domestic policies guide the development in the domestic domain. Now, apart from that, what consists as the core of foreign policy is national interest. So it simply means that foreign policy's primary task is to pursue and articulate national interest in terms of economic goals of a country, security goals of a country, and what can be called status goals of a country. And thirdly, while one is doing so, foreign policy also consists of principles or values which a country holds dear. So we can look at foreign policy encompassing of all these activities.
So thank you, sir, for explaining our viewers the foreign policy related aspects. So now as we are seeing that foreign policy generally shapes the nation's identity. So how that particular thing is possible, how foreign policy is shaping a nation's identity?
So in this aspect, one has to look at identity comprising of two parts. One is what you yourself think of you, or what is one's own self-identity, and then what is it that the others see you as.
Right.
So the identity of a country, which comes from its cultural, civilizational ethos, its historical understanding of itself, that shapes foreign policy, especially in terms of values and principles. And then when one is pursuing the foreign policy based on those values and principles, that creates an image of a country in the minds of others. So one is as related with the image of a country in the minds of peers or other states, and another is what values or principles are there in the foreign policy that comes from the self-identity of a country. So if we understand it through example, now look at India's response to various conflicts since independence and look at the latest example of the Ukraine issue or the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Now, India's primary insistence would be cessation of hostility, or India's primary insistence would be on dialogue. So the Prime Minister also said that current era is not an era of war or conflict, it is an era of dialogue and diplomacy. Now, if you look at it, it primarily flows from the values that we have defined for ourselves. And for that, understanding that easily, you go to the Constitution itself. And Article 51 of the Indian Constitution clearly talks about promotion of peace and security across the globe. So consistently across the eras, these principles have helped India define its position. That was one example.
So thank you very much, sir, for explaining with the example, and I think that would be beneficial for understanding this complex concept. Now, sir, talking regarding India specifically, so how India has shaped its foreign policy, or how the other factors that led to shaping of India's foreign policy since its independence?
So, foreign policy, like any other policy, does not operate in vacuum. The context is very important. Now, one way of understanding evolution of India's foreign policy is to classify it in phases. Now, this classification takes into consideration the most important developments of the era and India's responses to it, and comes to the conclusion of some of the important features defining foreign policy of that particular era. For example, in 2018, the External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, giving a speech, the Ramnath Goenka Memorial Lecture, talked about India's foreign policy in 6 phases. So, for this classification is for the ease of understanding, and it simply means the context and India's responses, thereby understanding the basic features of that particular era. So, if we see, Vishal, today India's economy is a much larger economy as compared to what was India's economy when India became independent. 2018, the size of India's economy was upward of 140 lakh crores. When India became independent, India's economy was less than 3 lakh crores. So it means that your economic status, secondly, your geography, where you are located, thirdly, your history, your culture, your self-understanding, and fourthly, what is happening in the larger world. These are all factors which should be looked into understanding the evolution of foreign policy. So when India became independent, one, our priorities, domestic priorities of industrialization or poverty elevation, these were the basic goals in forming the foreign policy. Our values came from freedom struggle, as also articulated in the Constitution, and the external scenario was such that 2 major power blocks, one led by the US, another led by the USSR, were intent on shaping the outcomes in international relations. Now, India, from the time it became independent till now also, has this view that the world should not be dominated by any set of powers. So then, while India participated in international developments like, for example, India is a founding member of United Nations, but when it became clear that the way global politics is being shaped by global powers, India would need to devise its own path, and that path came in the form of a choice for non-alignment. And as such it was happening, other countries were also becoming independent. So Asian solidarity was the international aspect of India's foreign policy. So we can say in the first phase, our foreign policy is in the formative year, and there is more emphasis, apart from our own national interest, there is more emphasis on the idealism of non-alignment. And then going forward, we would see that no policy can be perfect. So when faced with reality, you would see certain successes, certain failures of any phase. So the major break came in the first phase in 1962, wherein India had articulated its position with China in the form of Panchsheel. This idealism did not prevent China from invading India. So there is a certain sense of realism which comes in foreign policy after 1962, modernization of military or building of institutions of scientific establishment. That is something which is happening. And you would see in the 1960s externally what is happening is there is a Sino-Soviet rift. China and USSR for different reasons are developing differences. So in this period, US, it would seem by the beginning of 1970s drifts towards China. And with China, we already have a border dispute and we have a history of war, and US is more inclined towards Pakistan also. So now this starts shaping India's choices externally, and with USSR, we found it easier to do business in terms of how USSR's approach at the UN was not opposed to India, rather it supported what India's basic understanding was. So you would see it by the 1970s, 1971 particularly, there is the signing of India-Soviet Union Treaty of Friendship. Externally, that is happening. And in our surroundings, what we see is 1971 is also the year when we dealt a decisive blow to Pakistan in the war for the liberation of Bangladesh. Now, this is the phase which is generally referred to as phase of self-help, which is marked by certain degree of realism, and the idealism in terms of speeches and statements, articulation of principles continues. Now, this phase faces a crisis in 1980s, and primarily the crisis comes in the form of weak economic performance of India. So, it is very clear that the economic policies of the past are not working anymore, and internally you would also see this is also an era of multiple insurgencies, and some of these insurgencies are associated with these states with whom we share borders. So, this phase is also marked by India taking certain steps to be assertive in its neighborhood. So, for example, involvement in the Tamil question in Sri Lanka, signing of India-Sri Lanka peace accord, or sending of India's troops to Maldives to prevent a coup, which is also called Operation Cactus. These are some of the examples of assertiveness in the neighborhood. But ultimately, what you see is 1980s is also a decade where a global crisis is brewing up, or certainly changes are happening globally. So, by the end of 1980s, a combination of these factors meant that in the policies of the past no longer served India's interest in the changing world. So, 1991, with the collapse of Soviet Union, we see the era of self-help marked by realism and continuation of idealism comes to an end, and India has to make choices. So, 1991 is a time when India looks at the world as a collaborator. It decides to open its economy, and economy, the trade aspect is a primary focus for augmenting India's economic status. So, we are in search for newer partners. So, thereby you will see 1990s onwards we have policies like Act East focusing on relations with Southeast Asia, and then you would also see gradually this is a period in which India adopts a policy which many would say is focusing on defense of strategic autonomy, maintaining independence of foreign policy decisions while serving our national interest. And India's collaboration with multiple set of actors acquires a name in the form of multi-alignment, which is simultaneously engaging with multiple power centers. And this is all to serve India's interest, primarily of economy. Now, gradually what we would see is that India's involvement in various international platforms is a primary feature of this phase, whereby we become a member of BRICS, we become a member of SCO. In this period, we start getting engaged with SCO, and we are a prominent part of G20 also. Now, as far as the evolution is concerned, the era after 2014 can be considered as the current era because of the continuation of the same dispensation, same government, same political party being in power. Now, this era has been characterized by those who look at this in a sense of greater assertion of India. The words like New India have been used to define India's newer approach. But you would see that in this era also, the values and principles that we have articulated consistently inform our position. Our engagement with great powers has been focused on safeguarding India's interests, and we, as Dr. Jaishankar has also put it, we are now more willing to participate in what are called coalition of the like-minded. One example would be our interaction with the Quad countries.
So, sir, that was very comprehensive, and I think that has clarified each and every doubt related to the foreign policy. So, sir, if I may ask you a broader question, like as you have pointed regarding like the era changed after 2014, like where certain kind of specific changes were happening. So, if I may ask regarding the world situation, like in last 10 years, what kind of changes were observed in general in terms of global scenario that led or that made India a kind of like compulsion to change its foreign policy outlook?
So, with changing times, one has to change, and any foreign policy also has to change because it is responding to a changing circumstance. And the question of change in international relations is such that if you go back in history, in every decade people have been talking about drastic changes. But then there is a pattern which we can see that in major powers, governments change or their approach changes towards how they would like to deal with the international community. Similarly, what you would see is technological development or other factor of change. And thirdly, you would see non-state actors like terrorist groups or non-state factors like climate change. These have become major part of the discourse on international relations. So the changes in India faced in 2014 were to do with how the global economic outlook itself was changing as an aftermath of, as an after effect of the 2008 global economic crisis. Secondly, what we see is that the US was now talking about pivot to Asia, wherein it identifies China as its main contender and its express focus is now on Asia, specifically the Pacific part of Asia. At the same time, the efforts since 1990s to bring a rapprochement between Russia and the West, primarily the US, have not resulted into a major breakthrough. So that situation is also on the boil. So for example, 2014, Russia invades Ukraine, and that is opening up of a new geopolitical fault line. Apart from that, what you would see is the questions like climate change, questions like pandemic, or how do we deal with issues like global health challenges, they are all indicate towards the need for developing technological prowess in a country, and technology so far has been controlled very tightly in terms of sharing of technology or transfer of technology. So all these circumstances indicate that any government in 2014 would have to take into consideration these changes. At the same time, when we come close to home, what we see is there is continued legacy issue or continuation of the past issues of difficulty in relations with Pakistan, where primarily our concern is Pakistan's promotion of terrorism, cross-border terrorism. And with China, the border related negotiations have not led to any breakthrough, and China continues to use border as an instrument to put pressure on India. These were the challenges that the new government, which came into power in 2014, was facing and had to respond to.
Right. So what you are suggesting that foreign policy of any country is already having kind of continuity as well as the changes with respect to the time and space.
Yes, we say that in foreign policy there is continuity and change. Sometimes there is more change, and sometimes there is less change. But then the continuous elements are, as I said, our basic principles, our priorities.
Exactly. So, sir, there was a major event last year, like the G20. So, how do you see these kind of events like shaping India's foreign policy or posing India's kind of like stature at the global scale?
To answer that question, we have to start by looking at the fundamentals of India itself. So, by any measure of influence, India is an important country, whether it be the geographical size of India or the demographic size of India or the economic size of India or the resource endowment that we have, or another aspect that has been highlighted, which is the young demography that we have and a large pool of skilled workers that we have. So, by any equation, India is going to be an important country. Now, this is the potential of India. To translate the potential of India, what we need is not isolation but greater engagement with the world. So, India's participation in G20 since 1999 is an example of how India has been engaging in pursuit of its national interest with the larger international community. India hosting the G20 is the pinnacle of this process, where India prominently was in a position to showcase its capabilities and what it brings to the table. That India is a solution provider, and that is what we did. Apart from that, G20 was also a platform to, in a way, communicate to the world that India is a diverse country. The diversity of culture, the diversity of solution, the demographic, geographic diversity, they were all showcased during the G20 process. And thirdly, linked with the first point, India's focus on providing public service delivery with the use of digital technologies, which is based on our own experiences, is something that India is showing or showcasing as its contribution to the needs of a large part of international community, which is called as Global South. And apart from that, we are at the same time interacting with global powers like the United States, and IMEC, India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, which is proposed during the G20 meetings, is also another example that how India is comfortable in interacting with diverse sets of actors. So, we are part of very diverse clubs. It is again, as I said, a reflection of what has been defined as multi-alignment, and also India's confidence, India's willingness to engage with diverse set of actors, guided by its own interest and guided by its own principles.
So, sir, a lot of opportunities, lot of other aspects that India is right now having, and that is leading to change of India's foreign policy structure, and specifically the events like G20. So, sir, now as there are a lot of changes happening, this also comes with a lot of challenges that India has to face in the turmoil that the world is facing right now. So, what do you see, sir, in terms of like the challenges that the foreign policy of India specifically that is facing in this particular turmoil-led world?
So here we can adopt a simple approach by first starting from where we are. So looking at the neighborhood, the challenges would continue to be the ones which have been identified, which is one, difficult relations with Pakistan, particularly in light of its continued irrational policy of harming India's interests, promotion of terrorism. There is a territorial question of the parts of Jammu and Kashmir which have been illegally occupied by Pakistan. Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So these would be some of the territorial questions. On the other side, we have China. The border issue with China has been on the boil since 2020, and as China continuously displays a unilateral, aggressive, assertive approach, it would continue to be a challenge to which India has to respond to. Now, going to the Indian Ocean region, what we see is as India's trade increases, as India's energy import continues to rise, maritime security would be a concern, and when there is no credible power which is able to provide the public goods of security in the Indian Ocean region, India would have to play a larger role. As we see that, for example, during the troubles in the Red Sea trade corridor, we have dispatched our naval ships under Operational Sankalp for promoting maritime security. So that is something that would have to be the priority of India. That would be a challenge also. How do we augment our capacity? How do we promote approach like Sagar? And how do we attract more partners? In the Indian Ocean region itself, the rise of China would pose a challenge to India, depending on how China shapes or articulates its policies. So far, it seems that China has played more an adversarial role. So, a competition in the Indian Ocean region with China is a given. So, for example, promotion of activities like logistics sharing, for example, at Dukh with Oman, or promotion of infrastructure connectivity initiatives like with Iran at Chabahar or Agalega Islands in Mauritius. These would also be challenging India in terms of augmenting its own capacity and ability to deliver. Now, bringing the geography to a larger scope, in the Indo-Pacific again, the main question is rules-based order. Should the conduct of countries be based on how much power do they have, or should the conduct of countries be based on a set of principles or rules which have been agreed upon? And India would prefer the latter. And in that sense, insofar as China continues its aggressive, assertive approach and it becomes a challenge to the rules-based order, India would have to become part of solutions. So that means greater engagement with Quad and individually or bilaterally closer cooperation with countries like countries of Southeast Asia, ASEAN, Japan, United States and Australia. Going further to Eurasia, what we see is our friend Russia is facing two-pronged dilemma. One is its war efforts in Ukraine so far are not going anywhere, and it remains engaged in a logjam with the West. At the same time, its dependence on China is increasing. So how do we navigate that relation in Eurasia, relation with Russia, is a very important question that India would have to answer. The choices are not as simple as leaving Russia and joining USA. The challenge is how do we maintain our multi-alignment, or sometimes people are saying all alignment, in a situation where diverse actors are antagonistically poised. Globally, reforms of the multilateral system as articulated by India in the form of norms, new orientation for a reformed multilateral system. This would be the priority, with one of the most visible aspect of it would be reforms of the UN and United Nations Security Council with a permanent seat of India. And in terms of issues, climate change and its implications, terrorism and its implications for security, and larger global health challenges as shown by COVID-19. These would be some of the challenges that India would have to face. And lastly, technology is a key in all these aspects. So on the one hand, efforts would be required for India becoming a part of nuclear suppliers group. At the same time, in the coming decade, we would see the direction which initiatives like Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies with the US or Trade Technology Council with Europe takes. Now, these would be some of the open questions, the answers to which we would have to search.
So now, sir, talking regarding the kind of opportunities, because you have highlighted a lot of significant challenges that Indian foreign policy at this juncture is facing. So, like considering that India's global stature is also increasing along with its economy, political power, and other aspects. So, what kind of opportunities that India is currently having at the global level?
So, every challenge is an opportunity. So, for example, when the Russia-Ukraine crisis happened, the challenge was what kind of changes would come about in the global energy market, global energy prices. And the opportunity was that Russia had to offer discounted oil to India, and India had an opportunity to buy discounted oil. Now, once you have identified your choices very clearly, it's a matter of how do you navigate the difficulties. So, there are multiple opportunities. As I said, let's start with technology. Now, apart from China, all the major members or major powers are in favor of India joining the NSG. So, it would be a matter of continuous effort. Secondly, we see through ICET that there is a greater focus on developing collaboration for development of newer technology. But the challenge for India is, and the opportunity for India is, while development of newer technology continues to be a process, how do we convince our partners to transfer much needed existing technologies in sectors like defense and other areas? Similarly, when two powers are contending with each other, it's a bargaining opportunity, because each power would like India to take their side. So, what do we get in return is a primary question that India can ask. And as you would see a few months back, Dr. Jaishankar at the Berlin Security Conference, the Munich Security Conference, had said that
good partners provide choices. Smart partners take some of those choices.
Good partners provide us opportunities or choices, and smart partners take some of them. So, among all the choices or which are given to us by our partners like US or Russia, it is up to us to take those choices. So, for example, one of the primary areas where we can deliver concrete results taking this opportunity of change is acquiring capabilities like nuclear powered, nuclear capable submarines, all right, because AUKUS like developments are taking place, people are talking about JAWCUS also. So, as great powers play their game, a power like India, which has been comfortable in not taking sides and very successfully held this position, would have an opportunity to bargain and gain what it wants to get from these countries. But the challenge is clearly identifying what is it that we are seeking.
So, sir, another last question, like from my side, multi-alignment, strategic alignment, or non-alignment, what should be the policy option that India should be adopting now?
As you see, India's major relations are defined in terms of partnership. We should not forget that. We are not too keen to join any military alliances in the traditional sense, because we don't want to get entangled into others' conflict. So, entanglements have to be avoided. So, as far as the choice is concerned, the choice would be a combination. Of course, multi-alignment is in a way the preferred formula, because it allows us to engage with all the major power centers, all the relevant power centers simultaneously. Strategic alignment can happen only insofar as interests converge. So, where there is convergence of interests, more than strategic alignment, strategic partnerships would be the way forward. And I am forgetting the third term that you mentioned. Non-alignment. Non-alignment. Now, you see, strangely, non-alignment as a choice is again becoming attractive. So, for example, when great powers are intent on bending the choices of other countries, non-alignment may be a viable choice in some cases, all right, but that purpose is already served by non-alignment, multi-alignment.
So thank you very much, sir, for joining us for today's session. And I think a lot of issues that student might be facing in this complex topics like foreign policy, understanding the evolution of foreign policy that student faces in general, I think after this particular video, all these are going to get vanish because you have beautifully summarized each and everything and provided with the examples.
Thank you, Vishal. It was an absolute pleasure. I hope we learned something.
Thank you, sir. So with this, we ended this particular conversational topic, which was Beyond Borders, mapping India's foreign policy trajectory. So as sir has highlighted that India is not having very limited set of choices available, even regarding the strategic alignment, non-alignment and multi-alignment. All sets of options are available with India, but India need to choose all these according to its interests. So it's the national interests that are supreme in all the cases. So with this, we are wrapping up this conversation session. For more such sessions on international relations and other subjects, stay tuned with Vision IAS. Thank you.